Welcome to How to Make an Electric Guitar, Part 6, Applying the Finish. To prepare the body for finishing, start by sanding it as smooth as you can get it with 220 grit sandpaper. For this guitar project, I'm using RIT clothing dye because it's inexpensive and it does a great job. RIT dye also dries fast, especially if you use a hairdryer to help it along. This is what the body of the guitar looks like before I added the dye. Then I used black dye on just the top to really help the figured grains stand out. After the black had dried, I went over the body with red dye. I mixed about 2 tablespoons of dye to 1 cup of water to get a nice strong mixture. Then I let the guitar sit for a couple of hours to completely dry. Dye gets on everything, including the binding, so I just used a metal scraper to remove it from the edges. There were a couple of spots where I didn't like the way the dye set, so I went back in to touch it up. I applied a concentrated mixture of the red dye using a loaded Q-tip. Then I used the same technique to get the headstock to match. Once the dye had dried, I went back over the entire body and the headstock with some sanding sealer. After sanding the sealer smooth, I went over the entire body with some wipe-on polyurethane. The poly dries really glossy, but as you can see, this reflection is a little bit rough along the edges. I let each coat of poly dry for about 3 to 4 hours, and then in between coats I wiped the body down with some steel wool. After wiping the body down, and before applying the poly, I first vacuumed up as much of the dust as I could. Then I used a strong magnet to pick up the fine pieces of steel wool that were left over. Just before wiping on the next layer of poly, I wiped down the body with a rag to remove any oily fingerprints. Each coat of poly is wiped on thin to avoid runs and drips. I like to suspend the body with a coat hanger so I can get to all the sides at once. That saves time. I applied a total of 20 coats of poly, which cured in about 3 days. Then I began the process of wet sanding. I started by wrapping a foam rubber block in some 400 grit wet dry sandpaper to smooth the surface. I used just enough water so the paper would really grab the surface instead of sliding around. The results produce a slurry of water and polyurethane which has to be wiped away when it builds up. After sanding to 1500 grit, I polished the surface with scratch remover. The end result was a beautiful, scratch-free yet durable top coat. For more information on building electric guitars and low-cost plans, visit eguitarplans.com.